The night was bitterly cold. The Wyoming winter had a way of creeping into your bones, and even the wind seemed to mourn the desolate emptiness of the land. The train station sat silent, its wooden walls creaking in the wind, with only the soft glow of a single lantern casting a faint circle of light on the worn platform. It had been hours since the last train had come through. The station master had gone home hours ago, leaving the place abandoned, save for one figure. Lamar Carter had ridden out from his ranch that evening, expecting a simple supply delivery. His ranch wasn't much, just a stretch of land that barely kept him fed and the animals alive. He had no family left, only the memories of his late wife, Sarah, and their young son, Thomas. Life hadn't been kind to him in the 3 years since their deaths, and his heart felt as empty as the land he worked. Yet, there was always work to be done, and tonight, he was hoping the supplies would help ease the long, hard winter ahead. But as he approached the station on horseback, he saw something unexpected. There, sitting alone on the cold wooden bench, was a young woman, her figure shivering in the harsh wind. She was dressed in a thin nurse's uniform, nothing nearly warm enough to protect her from the biting cold. Her shoulders shook and her hands clutched a crumpled telegram to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Her face was pale, her eyes red, rimmed, and distant. She hadn't even noticed him. Arrive. Lamar's heart softened at the sight. He'd seen suffering in the world. His own had been a daily companion since the loss of his family. But something about the woman in front of him made him feel an urgency he couldn't explain as he dismounted his horse. She finally looked up, and he saw her tears frozen on her cheeks. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said, "They're all gone." Lamar's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" he asked, moving toward her. But before she could answer, she slumped forward, unconscious from a cold. He caught her just in time, her crumpled telegram falling from her hands. Lamar knew the telegram. It was from the Henderson family, a ranching family in the area that had been struggling to make ends meet just like him. It was tragic news. The entire Henderson family had perished in a fire. The message was blunt, emotionless, and final position. No longer available. His chest tightened. He didn't know the woman in his arms, but the pain in her face struck something deep within him. She was alone in the world, just as he had been. His mind raced. He couldn't leave her here. He couldn't just ride away and pretend he hadn't seen her. It wasn't just the cold that would kill her, but the loneliness in her eyes, the despair that seemed to hang over her like a dark cloud. As he gently lifted her onto his horse, wrapping his coat around her fragile frame, he whispered, "I'll take you to my ranch just for tonight." She barely responded, her head resting against his chest as they made their way through the dark, snow-covered landscape. The only sound was the soft clapping of the horse's hooves and the quiet howling of the wind. Elise's breathing was shallow, and Lamar could feel the weight of her vulnerability in the way she leaned against him. "I can't let you stay out here," Lamar murmured to himself, though his words held little conviction. There was no one at the ranch to turn to, no family to help him care for this woman. He was a man alone, barely scraping by, and yet something in him, something long buried beneath the weight of grief, spurred him to act. As they arrived at the small ranch house, Lamar dismounted and carefully helped her to the door. The house, modest and worn, was the only home he had now. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and tonight it was a shelter from the storm. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting a faint glow in the otherwise dark house. The walls were lined with simple furniture, a worn table, chairs, and shelves full of books. It was a place of survival, not comfort, but it was clean. He had taken care of it in his own way since Sarah had passed. Lamar gently laid Elisa on the bed in the small room where his wife used to sleep. The smell of lavender still clung to the sheets, a reminder of a life that had been lost, a life that had been full of promise and love. It was almost painful to let another woman sleep in this space. But he had no choice. "I'll sleep by the fire," he told her, though she barely registered his words. She had already fallen into a restless sleep. In the kitchen, Lamar busied himself with making a simple meal from what Lily had left. The vegetables were sparse, and the broth he made was thin, but it was all he had to offer. As he placed a bowl on the table and sat down to eat his own meager portion, he couldn't help but glance at the bedroom door, his thoughts full of the young woman who had appeared on his doorstep, uninvited, and yet somehow she seemed to belong there. Elisa, lying in the bed, awoke briefly, her eyes flickering open. She saw the night dress beside her, a delicate piece of clothing that felt foreign in her hands. It smelled faintly of lavender, the scent of a life she could never claim. For a moment, she closed her eyes and thought, I'm just replacing someone else. The thought sent a chill through her. She couldn't help but feel like an intruder in someone else's life, but at the same time, she knew there was no other place for her to go. She was alone now, with nothing left but the remnants of a life she couldn't even begin to piece together. Lamar, meanwhile, sat quietly by the fire, lost in thought. His mind wandered to his late wife, Sarah, and the child they had lost. He whispered to the flames as though speaking to her directly, "Forgive me for bringing her here." The room grew silent, and the weight of the night settled over them both. Neither of them knew that in the coming months their lives would intertwine in ways they could never have imagined. Neither of them knew that by spring the entire territory would know their names. But for now the storm outside raged on, and inside, two lonely souls found a moment of peace. The morning light crept into the small ranch house, bringing with it a cold reminder of the winter outside. Elisa woke before dawn, as nurses often did, her body used to the rhythm of early mornings and long shifts. The house was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Lamar's breathing. She shivered beneath the blanket, the thinness of her uniform still biting at her skin. The night had been long and uncomfortable, and yet, despite the weight of grief and uncertainty hanging over her, she had found a strange sense of peace in the warmth of the fire and the safety of Lamar's home. She had no idea what the future held, but for now, she could sleep without the constant fear that had followed her for months. As she lay there staring at the ceiling, she realized that she couldn't just stay here without contributing. She had to earn her keep to prove that she wasn't a burden to the man who had so kindly taken her in. Lamar had his own struggles, and she couldn't let him take on hers, not after everything he'd done. Quietly, she slid out of bed and moved toward the kitchen. The place was as sparse as the rest of the house, but she could already see that the kitchen needed attention. The counters were cluttered with dishes, and the small stove had been poorly maintained. Without a second thought, Elisa began to clean, her hands moving automatically as she prepared breakfast from what little they had. There was no meat, no extravagant ingredients, but the bread was still good, and the small stash of eggs would make a simple yet nourishing breakfast. Her hands worked quickly, her mind focused on the task at hand. The smell of coffee and baking biscuits filled the air, a scent that felt like a promise of something better, something warmer. When Lamar awoke, the sounds of movement in the kitchen startled him. It was the first time in months that he'd heard the house come alive, and the smell of food cooking made his stomach growl in a way it hadn't for a long time. He stood in the doorway, frozen, for a moment as he watched Elisa, her back to him, moving through the kitchen with quiet confidence. He'd expected her to be weak, fragile, not someone who would immediately take charge of the house and the kitchen. Yet here she was, her hands deftly preparing a meal, setting the table, and even starting the fire in the stove, something Lamar himself had struggled to do in the past. His heart stirred with something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of warmth, a spark of appreciation. "You didn't need to do all this," he said, stepping into the room. His voice was rough still and used a human connection. But Elisa turned to face him with a small, shy smile. "You saved my life, Mr. Carter. This is the least I can do," she replied, her voice soft but steady. Lamar, he corrected her, his lips tugging into a hesitant smile. Just, Lamar. There was a long pause, a moment where something shifted between them. Elisa's smile deepened, and Lamar couldn't help but feel a flicker of something in his chest. An unspoken, understanding, a shared moment of connection. As they sat down to breakfast together, the awkwardness that had once filled the air began to dissipate. Lamar watched Elisa as she ate, her hands shaking slightly from the cold, but her eyes clear and focused. She was no longer the fragile woman he had found at the train station. She was someone with purpose, someone who had survived against all odds. He could see now that she wasn't just a stranger, but a person who had strength, who had fought through hardships much like he had. Old Tom, the ranch hand, arrived shortly after breakfast, ready to start the day's work. Lamar had been dreading the moment when he would have to explain Elisa's presence to Tom. But when the old man saw the woman in the kitchen, he raised an eyebrow and smiled knowingly. "She's helping temporarily," Lamar said, his voice a little too defensive. Tom's smile widened as he gave a knowing nod. "Sure, boss. Temporarily." Lamar's cheeks flushed at the implied meaning, but he couldn't deny that something in him had changed since Elisa had arrived. He didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was her quiet strength or the way she seemed to have a place in this house, when everything else had felt so empty. But he couldn't ignore it. He found himself wanting to keep her here, though. He couldn't yet admit it to himself. Later that morning, disaster struck when old Tom's horse spooked and threw him against a nearby fence. Lamar rushed to his side, but it was clear that Tom had been badly hurt, his ribs possibly broken. There was no time to waste. Lamar knew that the nearest doctor was 30 miles away, and Tom wouldn't survive the trip. Elisa, though, didn't hesitate. She moved with calm precision, her voice steady as she gave instructions. "Give me hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey." Now Lamar obeyed without question, too, focused on the task at hand to think of anything else. He watched as Elisa worked, her hands moving expertly over Tom's body, her eyes focused, her face calm. She checked his injuries, pressing gently on his ribs. And when she looked up at Lamar, she spoke with a quiet authority. "Broken ribs, no internal bleeding. He'll live." Her hands moved quickly as she bound the ribs with torn sheets, creating an herbal remedy to help with Tom's pain. Lamar was in awe of her. She was strong, skilled, and completely unafraid of the task at hand. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a healer, someone who knew exactly what to do in moments of crisis. Afterward, as Tom rested, Elisa stayed by his side, offering gentle reassurances, her voice soft and steady. Lamar couldn't help but admire her more in that moment. She was no longer the helpless woman he had found on the train station platform. She was a force in her own right, someone who had a purpose, who knew exactly what she was doing. As they sat down for a quiet meal that evening, the weight of the day's events hung in the air between them. Lamar's heart softened even more, and as he looked across the table at Elisa, he realized that she was becoming more than just a temporary guest in his home. She was someone he could rely on, someone who had already proven her worth. "Where did you train?" he asked, quietly. Elisa hesitated before answering, her voice tinged with sadness. "Orphanage, nursing school. I've never had a permanent place. Always moving on to the next job." There was a sadness in her voice, a longing for something more than just survival. Lamar nodded, understanding. "I lost my wife and son to fever 3 years ago," he said, softly. "Since then, I've just been surviving. I haven't known how to live." "Not really." Elisa's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, touching his hand gently. "Maybe that's enough. Just surviving until you're ready to live again." Lamar looked at her, his heart heavy with unspoken emotion. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't need to have everything figured out right now. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark that maybe, just maybe, he could start living again. That evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, neither of them noticed the way their lives were slowly beginning to change. They sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared experiences hanging in the air, neither of them realizing that they were no longer saying temporarily. They were beginning to understand that for the first time in a long while, they both had a place to belong. The winter weeks seemed to pass in a blur, with the snow never quite ceasing, blanketing everything in a quiet hush that seemed to match the rhythm of Lamar and Elisa's growing companionship. Elisa had fully integrated into ranch life. Her presence, now as natural as the soft hum of the wind against the barn. With Tom's injury behind him, she had become more than just a nurse. She was a steady force in Lamar's home, taking over many of the tasks that he had never been able to manage on his own, like making sure the kitchen was always stocked, the fire never went out, and the small house was kept in order. It was clear now that she was no longer a burden, but a partner, even if neither of them fully understood what that meant. She would often rise before the sun, preparing breakfast from whatever they had in the pantry, and Lamar would join her, both of them silently acknowledging the comfort they had found in each other's presence. Their mornings had become a ritual, a cup of coffee shared before the world woke, a quiet moment of connection that set the tone for the day. They worked side by side, Elisa tending to any medical needs that came up in the community and Lamar handling the ranch chores. Though he was becoming more skilled with the care of animals now that Elisa had taught him the basics of healing. Her patients came from miles around, and the ranch became a hub for those in need of her care. In turn, people brought what they could produce, homemade goods and supplies that helped keep the ranch alive through the harsh winter. While the trade was one of necessity, it began to feel more like a community, a group of people tied together by their shared struggles and by Elisa's unwavering dedication. Lamar had started to realize how much she had given to this place, how much she had made it better simply by being there. It was a quiet kind of miracle. Yet, beneath the simplicity of their growing routine, a deep and unspoken bond was developing between them. Elisa found herself laughing more, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. And Lamar, for the first time since Sarah's death, felt a stirring of hope that he thought he'd lost forever. He would catch himself watching her, seeing the way her eyes would light up when she talked about nursing, or the way she humbly accepted the gratitude of the people she helped. There was strength in her, a quiet, unyielding strength that he admired. And something else, too, a tenderness that had long since been buried in him, something he thought he might never feel again. As for Elisa, she found herself drawn to Lamar's kindness. Despite the rough exterior, he was gentle, especially with the animals. She had never seen a man so in tune with the creatures he cared for, his calm voice and steady hands, making the animals feel safe. She was learning more than just ranching skills from him. She was learning what it meant to truly live again, to rebuild something from the ashes of loss. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when their hands would brush as they passed something to one another, or when their eyes would meet and linger for just a beat too long. It was as if the silence between them was filled with unspoken words. Words neither of them dared to say. Words neither of them were ready to admit. Yet, it wasn't just the bond between the two of them that was changing. Their connection to the outside world was shifting, too. Lamar had always been wary of people, content to stay within his own boundaries. But as Elisa treated more and more people, he found himself opening up, even if only a little. Neighbors who once avoided him were now stopping by the ranch to check on Tom, to bring news, or just to offer help. It was as though Elisa's presence had softened not only his heart, but the hearts of everyone around them. But there were still those who whispered behind closed doors. The small town had its judgments, and while many of the people were grateful for Elisa's help, there were always those who saw her as an outsider, a woman, living with a man who wasn't her husband. Gossip was inevitable in a place like this, where privacy was hard to come by, and Lamar knew it would only get worse as time went on. He was used to the whispering, but Elisa had never been one to draw attention to herself, let alone to feel like she was being judged. It wasn't long before they had to go into town for the monthly supply run, and Elisa was nervous more than she had been before. She had lived most of her life in anonymity, always moving from one place to another, never staying long enough to be known. Now she was a fixture in Lamar's life, and with that came the inevitable eyes of the town. The first stop was the general store, where she hoped to remain unnoticed. But as soon as they stepped through the door, she could feel the eyes on her. The women behind the counter whispered, their eyes flicking between Elisa and Lamar, their murmurs sharp and judgmental. Elisa felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't used to being scrutinized, and the weight of their judgment made her feel small, like a wronged woman caught in a scandal. The words she overheard only made it worse. Living alone with him, unmarried, she's probably got no choice. Poor thing, another woman added. She probably doesn't know how to say no. Elisa's face flushed, and she turned her eyes to the floor, unable to meet their gaze. She hadn't realized how much their opinions would matter, how much they would shape how she felt about herself. She had come here with nothing but the desire to survive, to build a future, but now she felt like she was being reduced to something less than what she was. The whisper stung, but it was the final comment that cut the deepest. He's taking advantage of her desperation. As they walked out of the store, the words echoed in her mind. She felt her heart sink, the sting of their judgment leaving a bitter taste on her tongue. She had been so focused on doing what she could to survive, to build a life, that she hadn't stopped to consider how others might see her. She had never cared before, never thought about propriety. But now, with those words hanging in the air, she couldn't help but feel like she was part of a story she didn't belong to. Lamar could sense her discomfort, though she said nothing. He had overheard the remarks, too, and when they were alone on the wagon ride home, the tension between them was palpable. His heart ached for her, but there was nothing he could do to take away the weight of what she was feeling. "I'm sorry," he said after a long silence, his voice rough with emotion. "You should never have had to hear that." But Elisa only shook her head, her voice quiet. "I don't belong here, Lamar. I never have. I'm just a temporary solution to a permanent problem, and I can't do that to you." Lamar's chest tightened. "You don't have to leave," he said firmly, but the words didn't seem to make things better. The cold air between them had turned into something heavier, more suffocating. Elisa's resolve was weakening, and she knew the truth in her heart. She didn't belong. Not to this ranch, not to this place. She was an outsider, always had been, and she feared that if she stayed, she would only bring him down, dragging him into a life of shame. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "But you don't need to go anywhere," Lamar said, his voice tinged with frustration. But the words hung in the air, neither of them willing to admit the fear that had already crept in. The fear that no matter how much they wanted this, no matter how much they had built together, it might not be enough. The snowstorm came without warning, a furious, howling tempest that swept across the Wyoming plains with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. One moment the world was quiet, just the soft patter of snowflakes against the earth. And the next, the wind whipped through the trees with an intensity that made the house groan under the pressure. Lamar had been out in the barn with Tom, trying to secure the animals for the night, but within minutes, the storm descended, enveloping the land in a thick veil of white. The temperature plummeted so quickly that even the hardy ranch animals struggled to find shelter. Lamar's heart raced as he hurried to bring Tom inside. He knew that the storm was too dangerous to stay out in the barn. The last thing he needed was for old Tom to suffer from exposure. The house felt smaller with each passing minute, the cold creeping in from every crack and corner as the wind howled like an animal on the hunt. Elisa, already aware of the danger, worked quickly to prepare a place for Tom by the fire. She had seen enough of the storm's wrath in her life, but it still unsettled her to see it so close, so personal. She helped Lamar as best she could, guiding Tom inside with careful hands, making sure he was settled by the fire, his injuries still tender, but manageable for now. Despite the crisis at hand, Lamar couldn't help but feel a certain helplessness in the pit of his stomach. His instincts to protect had been honed over the years. But now, with the storm pressing in on all sides, he felt more vulnerable than he had ever been. Elisa, however, moved with an ease that surprised him. She was calm, steady, giving orders without hesitation, taking charge in a way that made him admire her. Even more, her competence in such a dire moment only deepened the connection between them. She worked tirelessly, her mind fully focused on Tom's care. But in the quiet moments when her eyes met, Lamar saw something more than just a nurse at work. He saw a woman who had a quiet strength that rivaled his own. He realized for the first time in a long while that he'd been fooling himself when he thought he could survive without her. The hours wore on, the storm raving. Outside and inside, the tension in the house grew thicker. It wasn't just the fear of the storm anymore. It was the unspoken weight between him and Elisa, a pressure that neither of them could shake. As the night dragged on, Lamar found himself unable to keep his mind from wandering. He thought of his wife, Sarah, of how she had been the light in his life, the one person who had made him believe that love was enough to overcome anything. But Sarah was gone now, and for 3 years, Lamar had lived in a shadow of that loss, unable to move past it. He had buried his love for her deep inside, unwilling to acknowledge that there might be room in his heart for someone else. But Elisa was different. She had entered his life like a breath of fresh air, quietly, but insistently making herself a part of his world. And he had begun to realize that he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He couldn't deny the way he felt when she was near, the warmth that spread through him at the sound of her laughter, the way his heart softened whenever their hands brushed. She had become more than just a guest in his home. She had become a part of his life. And yet he couldn't bring himself to say the words. Instead, he buried those feelings beneath a wall of silence, afraid to admit them, afraid to face the vulnerability that would come with acknowledging them. In the small hours of the morning, as the storm raged on, Lamar found himself feverish with a sickness that crept in unnoticed. The same illness that had taken his wife and son suddenly returned, creeping up his spine like a cold shadow. He didn't even realize it first. He thought it was just exhaustion from the stress of the night. But as the hours passed, the fever became too much to ignore. His body burned with the heat of it, his skin slick with sweat, and soon he was delirious, unable to keep himself upright. Elisa was at his side. Immediately, her training kicking in without a second thought. She laid him down on the bed, stripping off his damp clothes and replacing them with dry ones, trying to get him comfortable enough to sleep. But there was no comfort to be found, not with the fever raging through him like wildfire. His delirium made his words come out in a jumble, half-formed, desperate. He called out for Sarah, his voice thick with grief. "I am sorry, Sarah. I couldn't save you. I couldn't." His words broke Elisa's heart. She had seen the way he loved his late wife, the way the memories of her still clung to him like a second skin. But she also saw something else, the way he was beginning to rely on her, to trust her in a way he had never trusted anyone before. As she sat by his side, cool cloths in hand, her thoughts drifted to the way his fevered words had spoken her name. He had called for Sarah, yes, but the way he had said her name, the way his voice had broken as he spoke, told her everything she needed to know. She was no longer just a temporary presence in his life. She was there for him now in a way that went beyond nursing, beyond the simple role she had come to play. She was there because he needed her. And in that moment, she realized that she needed him too. The hours dragged on, and with every passing minute, Elisa's fear grew. She had lost so many people in her life, people she had cared for, people who had mattered to her, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him, too. She held his hand through the feverish delirium, whispering words of comfort that she didn't even know he could hear. "I'm here, Lamar. I'm not going anywhere. I love you. Please come back to me." It was the first time she had said the words out loud, though she had known them in her heart for weeks. She wasn't sure if he had heard her, but as he lay there, his body shaking with the fever, she knew she would stay. She had made a promise to herself that she wouldn't run, that she would face whatever came. Next with him by her side. And when the fever finally broke, when Lamar's eyes fluttered open, clear and steady, Elisa was there, just as she had promised. He looked at her, his voice weak, but full of something more. "You stayed," he said, softly, his hand reaching for hers. Elisa smiled through her exhaustion, tears in her eyes. "I always will," she whispered. And in that moment, the storm outside didn't matter anymore because they had both weathered it together. The morning after Lamar's fever broke, the storm outside had finally started to subside, leaving behind a bitter cold that clung to the air. But there was a palpable sense of relief inside the house. Lamar was still weak, but his fever had broken, and Elisa had stayed by his side, nursing him through the worst of it. The night had felt like a turning point in their relationship. She had stayed with him, had cared for him without hesitation, and the bond between them had shifted in a way neither could ignore. The world outside was still caught in the grip of winter, but inside, there was something warmer growing between them. Yet, as much as they both tried to focus on their immediate needs, on Lamar's recovery and the safety of the ranch, there was a new tension in the air. The night before, Elisa had confessed her love for him, though her words had come in a whisper in the quiet of his delirium, and he had responded in kind. But now, with the fever broken and the storm over, they both had to face the aftermath. For Elisa, that meant confronting the reality of her situation. And for Lamar, it meant confronting the fear that had kept him from letting anyone in for so long. The days following Lamar's recovery were filled with a mixture of quiet relief and unspoken questions. Elisa helped him regain his strength, caring for him with the same steady hands that had once treated so many others. She saw the vulnerability in him now, the way he would flinch when something reminded him of the past, of his wife, of his lost family. And she knew that he wasn't ready to face all that yet. She wasn't ready to push him either, but as she helped him through the days, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that she wasn't the only one struggling with what had happened. Meanwhile, the news of Lamar's illness and his eventual recovery had spread like wildfire through the community. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now arrived at the ranch, eager to offer help and support. At first, it had been small gestures, people bringing food or offering to tend to the animals, but soon turned into something bigger. People had come to appreciate Elisa, not just for her nursing skills, but for her kindness, her willingness to help others without asking for anything in return. She had become a part of this community in a way she hadn't expected. And with each passing day, she realized that she was building a life here. She had come to Wyoming as a woman with no family, no home. But now, it felt like she was finding her place in the world. And yet, despite the warmth of the people around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still an outsider. She had never stayed anywhere for long, and the thought of staying in one place, of letting herself belong, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The letter that arrived in the middle of the week only complicated things further. It came with the sound of hooves and the crack of a horse's snort outside the ranch house. Lamar had been sitting by the fire, his strength slowly returning, when a messenger arrived with the official seal of the territorial hospital. The letter was addressed to Elisa Keller, and when Lamar handed it to her, his eyes were clouded with uncertainty. Elisa recognized the name immediately. Dr. Morrison, the chief physician at the newly established hospital in the nearby town. The letter offered her a position as head nurse, a salary that would support her and provide her with the security she had never had. It promised respect, stability, and the kind of professional recognition that Elisa had always dreamed of. And yet, as she read through the letter, her heart felt heavy. She had been offered everything she had wanted when she had set out to become a nurse. But now, with Lamar's recovery, with the life she was building here, the offer felt like a distant dream, something that no longer fit her. Reality. She sat silently, the letter in her hands, the weight of it pressing down on her. Lamar noticed the tension in her posture, the way her hands gripped the paper as if it were a lifeline. He had always known she would eventually face this choice, but seeing it in black and white made it all the more real. He had never wanted her to sacrifice her dreams for him. And yet, seeing her hold the letter made him realize just how deeply he had come to care for her. Elisa was strong. He knew that she had built a life for herself from nothing. But now, when everything seemed to be falling into place, he was afraid that he would lose her. He didn't want to be the reason she gave up her dreams. But the thought of her leaving the ranch, leaving him, was more than he could bear. "It's a great opportunity," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though his words sounded hollow to his own ears. "You should consider it seriously." The words stung as soon as they left his mouth, and he could see the flicker of hurt in her eyes. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. "You think I should go?" she asked, her voice quiet. Lamar swallowed. Try to find the right words. "It's not that," he said. "It's just that I know how hard you've worked for this. I wouldn't want you to give it up for me." Elisa's eyes softened, and she shook her head. "You're not the reason I've been offered this," she said gently. "I never thought I would stay anywhere. I never thought I would find a place where I truly belonged." She paused, her gaze shifting to the ranch, to the small community they had built together. "But this place, this ranch, this life, it's more than I ever imagined, and I don't want to leave it. I don't want to leave you." Lamar's heart clenched at her words, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his own emotions. He wanted her to stay. He needed her to stay. But he also knew that she couldn't stay out of obligation, out of pity. She deserved to follow her own path, to choose what was best for her future. And yet, when he looked at her, when he saw the determination in her eyes, he realized that her choice wasn't just about the job. It was about the life they had built together, the quiet moments they had shared, the way their hearts had slowly come to trust each other. "You don't have to choose between me and your career," he said softly. "I want you to choose what makes you happy, Elisa. You deserve that." But Elisa shook her head, her smile small but sincere. "I've already made my choice," she said, her voice firm. "This is where I belong. With you." Lamar's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long while, he believed in something that wasn't just survival. It was hope. The week before the wedding, Lamar and Elisa worked together to prepare the ranch, their hearts full of quiet anticipation and the weight of everything they had been through together. The weather had turned slightly warmer, and spring seemed to be creeping in with its promise of new beginnings. Yet, even in the calm before the storm, the tension between them remained. Their love had grown in the stillness of winter. But now, as the day of the wedding approached, something unfamiliar loomed just out of sight. Elisa had never imagined that after so much loss and uncertainty, she would find herself standing on the cusp of a new life with Lamar. She had come to Wyoming with nothing but a hope for a fresh start, a future where she could finally put down roots. And now she was about to marry the man who had taught her that home was not just a place. It was a person. Lamar, too, had changed in ways he hadn't expected. He had opened his heart to her in ways he had never imagined possible. And now, with their wedding just days away, he found himself doubting if he truly deserved this happiness. He had spent so many years living in a shadow of grief, surviving rather than living. And yet Elisa's presence in his life had slowly but surely lifted that burden. Now, with the weight of their shared past behind them, they were about to begin a future together. But that week, as they both busied themselves with preparations, a stranger appeared in town, someone who threatened to shatter the fragile peace they had fought so hard to build. It was a late afternoon when the train pulled in, the whistle sounding long and mournful as the station platform was, blanketed in the glow of the fading light. Lamar had been working with Tom, repairing the fences in anticipation of spring when he first saw her. The woman stepped off the train with an air of refinement that was at odds with the rugged surroundings. She was dressed in a dark, well-tailored traveling coat, her face framed by a neat bonnet, and there was an air of elegance that marked her as someone who did not belong in this isolated corner of Wyoming. Lamar's heart tightened as he saw her approach. He had no idea who she was, but there was something about her that immediately caught his attention when she asked for directions to the Carter Ranch. The name itself seemed to carry a weight of its own. The woman's gaze shifted to Lamar, and for a brief moment, he froze. She looked familiar in a way that made his chest tighten, but he couldn't place where he had seen her before. The woman, noticing his hesitation, gave him a faint, polite smile. "I'm Catherine Henderson," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm the only surviving member of the Henderson family." The words hit Lamar like a punch to the gut. The Henderson family had perished in the fire that had claimed their ranch, a tragedy that had been at the heart of Elisa's arrival in Wyoming. Catherine, standing before him, was the last living member of the family Elisa had been hired to care for, the family whose death had led her to this very place. Lamar felt a wave of guilt wash over him as he recognized the implication. Elisa had already suffered so much loss, and now here was the woman who had survived it all, standing on a threshold of the life that Elisa had come to believe was behind her. Lamar led Catherine to the ranch, his mind spinning with the implications of her arrival. He found Elisa by the fire, her face lighting up when she saw him return. But when Catherine stepped into the room, a cool wave of silence swept over the space. Elisa froze, her eyes scanning the woman before her. "You're—" Elisa's voice trailed off as Catherine gave a small, apologetic smile. "I'm Catherine. I came to meet you, the nurse who was supposed to help us at the ranch," she explained softly. Elisa nodded, a flicker of recognition passing through her, but her face tightened. She had spent the last few months trying to move beyond the tragedy that had brought her here and now. With Catherine standing in front of her, the weight of her past felt as fresh and raw as the day she had received the telegram. Catherine didn't speak of the past much, focusing instead on the future, on her plans to rebuild the Henderson Ranch. She was starting over, she said, and she needed someone to help her manage it. "I'm reopening the ranch, Elisa," Catherine said, her tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of desperation. "I need a nurse to help me run things. The position is still yours if you want it." Lamar's heart sank as he listened to the words. He had known this day might come, but hearing it out loud, seeing the opportunity laid out before Elisa, made him realize just how much he had come to depend on her. He had been holding on to the idea of her staying, of their life together. But now that future seemed uncertain, Elisa looked at Catherine and then at Lamar, her heart torn. The offer was everything she had ever wanted, a chance to be the nurse she had trained to be, a career that would bring stability, respect, and purpose. It was everything she had come here to find. And yet, in that moment, it didn't feel like the right path. She had built a life here with Lamar, with this small, imperfect community. She had found something real, something worth fighting for. And yet, the temptation of the offer was undeniable. Lamar, sensing the turmoil in her, spoke softly. "It's a great opportunity, Elisa," he said. "You should take it. It's everything you wanted, everything you deserve." The words, though kind, cut deeper than either of them expected. Elisa's throat tightened as she tried to hold back tears. The conflict within her, threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent so long believing she would never belong anywhere, that any chance at a future was fleeting. But now she had something real. She had Lamar. She had this ranch. And she had a community that had come to care for her. She realized then that she couldn't let it go. "I've already made my choice," Elisa said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is where I belong with you." The weight of her decision settled over them both. And 4. The first time in months, Elisa felt like she could breathe. The future was no longer a question. It was a shared path, one they would walk together. The next morning, she sent a letter to Catherine declining the offer, choosing instead to stay in Wyoming and build a life with a man she had come to love. They would marry in 2 days, and their future, though uncertain, was theirs to create. The years that followed Lamar and Elise's wedding were a testament to the life they had built together, not just as partners, but as a family, a community. As the clinic they had established began to grow, so did their sense of purpose. The ranch, once a small, struggling piece of land, now thrived thanks to the help of the neighbors who had once doubted Elise's place in their midst. The two of them working side by side had created something not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. Each day, Elisa treated patients, helping them with the skills she had honed during her long years of training, while Amar worked with the animals, managing the land and ensuring that the ranch could support not just their needs, but those of the entire community. It wasn't always easy, but they had learned to rely on one another in ways they hadn't imagined possible. Every morning, the smell of coffee filled the air as Elisa prepared breakfast. And every evening, they would sit by the fire, sharing stories of the day's work. Their life together had found a steady rhythm. And though there were still challenges, droughts, late frosts, financial struggles they faced, them together always. As time went on, Elisa and Lamar's love grew deeper. The walls that had once surrounded Lamar's heart, built up from years of grief and loneliness, began to crumble piece by piece. He had come to realize that love wasn't just about surviving, about making it through the pain. It was about building something beautiful from it. Elisa had shown him that, and in turn he had shown her that a place could become home not just because of its walls, but because of the people who made it their own. By the time their first child, Sarah, was born, the ranch had become more than just a place for them to live. It was a sanctuary, a symbol of resilience, and the hope that life, no matter how broken it may seem, could always start anew. The community rallied around them, offering support during Sarah's birth and in the months that followed. It was a moment that marked not just the birth of a child, but the birth of a legacy, one that would stretch far beyond the ranch house. Over the years, more children came, and with each new arrival, Elisa and Lamar saw the strength of their partnership reflected in their growing family. Their clinic, which had started as a simple solution to a community need, expanded over time, becoming a vital part of the region, serving family for miles around. Elisa trained other women to become nurses, passing on the knowledge she had gained in her travels, while Lamar continued to build his ranch into something that would outlast them both. The couple had long since stopped seeing themselves as just survivors. They were builders, creators, people who had made a home out of the ashes of their past. By the time they celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary, their love and their work had made a tangible difference in the lives of others. It wasn't just about running a ranch or running a clinic. It was about how they had given hope to people who needed it most. The small town had grown, and so had its understanding of what it meant to build a community. Lamar and Elisa had taught them all that to survive in a place like this, you had to rely on one another. And in turn, the community had rallied behind them, offering labor and support. When times were hard,